Well, you're not supposed to ask the question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What if Iran flipped sides? What if the same regime that made death to America a national slogan, the same Iran that armed Hezbollah, backed Assad, and played global spoiler for decades, suddenly looks west and decides it has no other choice? Sounds like a stretch until you see what's happening on the ground, because Iran is unraveling. Its economy is on life support, its allies are unreliable, and its people are fed up. Its future depends on something unthinkable: re-engaging with the very countries it has spent the last 45 years demonizing. Let's be clear, Iran is not some helpless state. It's a nation with enormous energy reserves, a deep historical identity, and a population of 88 million people, most of whom weren't even alive when the Islamic Revolution happened. But today, Iran is facing a triple crisis: economic collapse, strategic isolation, and internal rebellion. The rial has lost over 90% of its value in the last decade. Youth unemployment is sky high. And the middle class, the very force that once sustained the regime's legitimacy, is rapidly shrinking. Meanwhile, Iran's supposed lifelines, Russia, China, and its regional proxies, they aren't stepping up. Russia is bogged down in Ukraine and demanding cheap drones. China is signing oil deals but offering no real investment or political backing. Even Iraq is beginning to distance itself from Tehran's influence. Iran's regional strategy, the so-called axis of resistance, it's cracking. And inside Iran, the population knows it. The protests after Mahsa Amini's death weren't just about hijabs. They were about freedom, jobs, inflation, opportunity, life. And while the regime crushed the protests with brutal force, the underlying anger, it didn't go away. It's spreading. The streets are quieter now, yes, but the silence isn't peace, it's pressure. It's waiting. And here's where things get even more dangerous for the regime. Iran built its survival model on being the anti-West, on using resistance as a brand, on blaming sanctions for its own failures, while still trading oil through back channels and playing global powers against each other. But in 2025, that model's collapsing because the global system itself has changed. The US doesn't need Middle Eastern oil anymore. Global shipping lanes are being rewritten by security, not efficiency. And China's own economic slowdown means Iran can't just lean east and expect salvation. In other words, Iran is running out of options. And that's where the idea, no matter how crazy it sounds, starts to make sense. What if the West is the only exit left? Not because Tehran has changed its ideology, but because survival forces hard choices. Because the average Iranian, especially the under 30 generation, isn't chanting for martyrdom. They're looking for jobs. They want stability. They want freedom, or at the very least, a future. And the regime knows it, which is why quietly, subtly, we're starting to see signs of something deeper. Back-channel talks, energy compromise discussions, even whispers of a new nuclear framework. Not out of goodwill, but out of desperation. Because here's the bottom line. Iran doesn't need to become pro-West. It just needs to become functional. And in a world being restructured around trade blocks, energy corridors, and hard power, functionality requires access. Access to markets, access to capital, access to the financial system. And only the West can provide that. So where does this go? If Iran pivots just slightly, it could flip the balance of the entire Middle East. It would isolate Russia even further. It would shake China's Belt and Road ambitions, and it would send shockwaves through every authoritarian regime clinging to a Cold War playbook. We're not there yet. Don't get crazy. But for the first time in a generation, we can see the cracks. If you're done with globalist bullshit and ready for straight talk, subscribe to America's Geopolitics. Because in this episode, we're going to follow the story of a regime in crisis and ask the question the rest of the world is still afraid to consider. What if Iran is about to flip? Let's break it down. Iran's economy isn't just struggling, it's suffocating. And unlike past downturns, this one isn't temporary. It's systemic, it's deep, and it's getting worse with every day that passes. Let's start with the currency. The Iranian rial has become practically worthless. Before the 1979 revolution, it had traded at 70 rials to the US dollar. Today, it's over 600,000 rials to the dollar on the black market. That's not a currency, that's a slow-motion collapse. Prices are skyrocketing. The cost of meat, rice, and basic staples is beyond the reach of most Iranian families. Official inflation numbers hover around 40%, but on the street, people say it feels like double that. And it's not just about money. Factories are closing, imports are drying up. The government can't fund basic infrastructure. Rolling blackouts are now a regular occurrence, especially in the summer. In a country that sits on some of the world's largest oil and gas reserves, people can't even keep the lights on? Seems pretty ridiculous. Now let's talk youth unemployment. Iran is one of the youngest countries in the region. Over 60% of its population is under the age of 30. And they're angry because after years of university education, degrees, mandatory military service for men. There's nothing waiting for them. No jobs, no future, no ability to afford rent, let alone start a family. And that's a problem the regime can't shoot its way out of. Sanctions are a huge part of the story, but not the whole story. Yes, U.S. and European sanctions have crippled Iran's ability to access the global financial system. Iran can't conduct basic international banking. It can't attract foreign investment. Even its oil sales are routed through convoluted networks of Chinese intermediaries and shadow tankers. But the truth is, the regime's own corruption and mismanagement have made everything worse. Billions of dollars are siphoned off through the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. State-owned enterprises dominate entire sectors, choking off private innovation. And any business that doesn't play ball with the regime's patronage system, it doesn't last long. This isn't just a government problem, it's a structural economic cancer. And now, it's metastasizing. Iran's middle class, the educated urban base that once carried the hope of reform, is being crushed. They're leaving in droves, brain drain is off the charts, doctors, engineers, coders, academics. They're heading for Turkey, Europe, Canada, anywhere that'll take them, really. What's left behind is a frustrated youth, a paralyzed economy, and an elite that can't admit the truth. The old model doesn't work anymore. Sound familiar? They can't export their way out, they can't blame the West forever, and China isn't coming to the rescue. At least not in the way Tehran hoped for. So the regime has a choice to make. Double down on resistance and risk total collapse, or find a way back into the global economy before it's too late. And that road, it doesn't run through Moscow or Beijing. It runs through Brussels, it runs through Washington, it runs through reform. The question isn't whether Iran is ready, it's whether the West is watching closely enough to notice what's shifting beneath the surface. For years, Iran believed it didn't need the West. It had a plan: pivot east, partner with China, arm up with Russia, and build an axis of resistance strong enough to defy sanctions, outmaneuver the U.S., and reshape the region in its own terms. But that strategy, well, I guess as you know, it's falling apart. Because China and Russia aren't saviors, they're actually opportunists, and Tehran is learning that lesson the hard way. Okay, let's start with China. Beijing is Iran's top oil customer. On paper, it buys about 1 million barrels a day, mostly at a discount and often through shell companies to avoid sanctions. But here's the catch. China pays less than market share, delays payments, and locks Iran into lopsided contracts that favor Beijing. Worse, China rarely invests in real infrastructure inside Iran. The 25-year strategic deal signed in 2021 is mostly symbolic. Little money, even less follow-through. Beijing sees Iran not as a partner, but as a discount fuel station with no alternatives. There's no military alliance, no protection on the world stage, no economic lifeline beyond basic energy trade. And now that China is cozying up to Saudi Arabia and brokering peace deals between Gulf rivals, Iran's usefulness is shrinking fast. Then there's Russia. Good old Russia. On the surface, the Tehran-Moscow relationship looks strong. Iran sells drones to Russia for use in Ukraine. Russia helps Iran evade its sanctions. Both are under Western pressure and like to talk tough about building a multipolar world. But dig deeper, and you'll find a relationship built on mutual weaknesses, not mutual strength. Russia is desperate for drones and ammunition. Iran is desperate for weapons, nuclear expertise, and geopolitical cover. But Russia is stretched thin. Its economy is in decline, its military is bleeding men and machines in Ukraine, and it's increasingly seen as too toxic for Iran to tie itself to long-term. Even among Iran's elite, there's growing unease. Do we really want to bet the future of our country on a declining, sanctioned, war-torn Russia? Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Because if Russia loses in Ukraine, or even just gets bogged down permanently, Iran is stuck holding the bag. The reality is pretty fucking simple. Neither China nor Russia can offer what Iran needs most right now: a stable financial system, a functioning industrial base, access to modern technology, and the political capital to rebuild global legitimacy. And you know what? Only the West has those tools, and the regime, despite its rhetoric, is starting to recognize that. That's why we're seeing backchannel diplomacy pick up again. That's why Europe is floating new nuclear terms. And it's why even hardliners inside Iran are beginning to hint that some kind of realignment, however small, might be on the table. Because China and Russia might be useful, but they're not enough. And when your economy is collapsing, your people are rebelling, and your energy exports are being sold at a loss, not enough becomes the biggest threat of all. If Iran's strategy was to dominate the region through fear and proxies, it worked for a while. From Beirut to Baghdad, from Sana'a to Damascus, the Iranian regime built a web of militias, political parties, and armed movements that gave it incredible reach across the Middle East. This so-called axis of resistance was more than just rhetoric. It was real. And for decades, it worked as a buffer against against Western pressure and Sunni rivals. But today, that access is cracking, and Iran is being quietly but decisively pushed to the margins of the very region it once tried to control. Let's start with Iraq, once Iran's most valuable prize after the U.S. invasion. Today, Iraqi leaders are walking a tightrope. Yes, Tehran still has influence, especially through its militias. But Iraq's government is increasingly focused on sovereignty, stability, and distance from Iran's chaos. Baghdad is signing deals with the U.S. and Gulf states. It's investing in infrastructure. It's trying to avoid being dragged into Iran's next confrontation with Israel or the West. Even Shiite populations in Iraq, once considered natural allies, are showing signs of fatigue. They don't want to become another battleground for Tehran's survival. Then there's the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain. After years of tension, these countries are de-escalating, but not out of trust. They're doing it out of strategy. Saudi Arabia's deal with Iran, brokered by China, wasn't a reconciliation. It was a containment strategy. Riyadh wants stability to focus on Vision 2030. It doesn't want war, but it also doesn't want Iran dictating the region's future. That's why Saudi Arabia is strengthening ties with Israel, hosting American troops, and modernizing its own military with U.S. and European help. Make no mistake, the Gulf is hedging against Iran, not embracing it. And Iran knows it. Even within Syria and Lebanon, Iran's longtime strongholds, things that are shifting. In Lebanon, Hezbollah grip is still strong, but the economic collapse and political gridlock are making the group more of a liability than a symbol of power. Across the region, Iran's proxies are struggling to govern, failing to deliver, and losing legitimacy. And that means Iran's regional strategy, built on exporting revolution and projecting dominance, is no longer sustainable. A new Middle East is forming. It's more pragmatic, less ideological, more open to business and cooperation with the West, especially the U.S. And Iran is stuck in the 1990s mindset. They're still fighting yesterday's battles, still clinging to alliances that no longer yield results. Its enemies have adapted, its neighbors have moved on, and even its allies are growing tired. This isn't just diplomatic isolation, it's irrelevance creeping in. And for a regime built on fear, defiance, and the illusion of regional supremacy, irrelevance is the beginning of the end. Now let's get one thing straight. The West didn't need Iran. But Iran, it might be about to realize it needs the West. For over 4 decades, the Islamic Republic built its identity on defiance, economic resistance, ideological purity, and anti-American foreign policy. It framed the West as corrupt, weak, and morally bankrupt. And it convinced much of its population, especially the older generation, that isolation was a price worth paying for sovereignty. But now, that illusion is breaking. Because defiance doesn't build power grids, it doesn't stabilize currency, and it doesn't feed 88 million people. In 2025, Iran is learning a hard truth. The West still holds all the keys. Despite years of sanctions, diplomatic rifts, and proxy wars, the global system still runs through Washington, Brussels, London, and their financial systems. Iran may be able to move oil through shadow tankers. It may have friendly trade headlines with China or Russia, but the fundamentals, capital, legitimacy, advanced tech, investment, are all still anchored in Western-led systems. And that system doesn't bend for ideology. It rewards alignment, stability, transparency, things the Islamic Republic have spent years rejecting. Let's talk functionality, because that's what this really comes down to. Iran doesn't need handouts, it needs access to the tools that keep a modern state running. Access to international banking systems like SWIFT, access to foreign direct investment and trade insurance, access to high-grade refinery parts, aviation tech, pharmaceuticals, and microelectronics, access to shipping lanes and insurance markets that make large-scale exports even viable. Those systems, they're all still Western-controlled. Even China, the so-called alternative superpower, relies on the West to keep its own supply chains running. Oh my God. Iran spent years trying to bypass the West. And in doing so, it also bypassed growth, innovation, and long-term economic stability. Here's what's changed. Even inside the regime, quietly the reality is sinking in. They're running out of time. The population is restless, the energy sector is aging, the street is angrier, the youth more emboldened, and the propaganda less effective. Survival now requires a shift, not just in tone, but in approach. And that shift can't come from Moscow, it can't come from Beijing. Only the West has the combination of money, influence, and infrastructure to help Iran climb out of its hole, even if Iran is willing to reach for it. Let's be clear, this isn't about friendship. It's not about waving the flag or reform or embracing democracy. I don't even think we care about that anymore. It's about pragmatism. Authoritarian regimes don't turn because of moral awakening. They turn when collapse becomes the more dangerous option. And Iran is getting close to that point. We've already seen the first hints. Silent pauses where there used to be fiery speeches, private feelers sent through European diplomat, rumors of new nuclear talks, not from strength, but from desperation. Even economic proposals floated inside Iran's module that have been unthinkable 5 years ago. These aren't reforms, they're warning flares, signals that the regime knows its model is cracking. So where does this lead? To the one direction they never wanted to look, west. Because for all the slogans, the rallies, and the decades of hostility, the West still offers what Iran needs: markets, technology, stability, and the ability to function in the modern world without begging for favors from failing powers. It won't be easy. The West has its own red lines, and Iran's regime has a long memory and a long list of enemies. But behind closed doors, the conversations are already happening. Because when the choice is reform or ruin, even the most stubborn regimes begin to ask, what would it take to survive? And Iran, that's where they're at. If Iran flips towards the West, it won't happen all at once. There won't be a dramatic press conference, there won't be an apology, and there sure won't be a flag-raising ceremony in Washington. This will be slow, subtle, strategic, because the regime can't admit failure, not publicly, but it can signal flexibility. It can test reactions, it can plant the seeds of a new posture while pretending nothing's changed. You know Iran, they're good at that. And that process has already begun. Step one is what we're already seeing: quiet diplomacy. European intermediaries, especially from France, Austria, and Switzerland, are once again being used to float trial balloons. New nuclear deal frameworks have been discussed, not publicly, but through private channels. Not because Iran suddenly loves the West, but because its leadership knows the current trajectory ends in collapse. A new deal might not be as ambitious as the JCPOA. It may be focused more narrowly, maybe on oil exports in exchange for inspections, or limited sanctions relief in return for technology access. But the point isn't the deal, it's the direction. Step two is rhetorical softening. We're already seeing a change in tone. The once daily chants of death to America, less prominent. The Friday sermons, less combative. Even the RGC media outlets have pulled back from the usual hardline language, replacing it with vaguer talk of national interest and strategic balance. It's not a coincidence, it's preparation. The regime is building space to pivot without looking weak to its base. Step three will be controlled economic reform, not full liberalization, but tactical changes, allowing more private sector activity, encouraging foreign capital and joint ventures, opening up select industries like automotive, telecom, and refining to outside partners, particularly those that can bring in Western components quietly through intermediaries. These reforms will be framed as domestic initiatives, not foreign concessions. But make no mistake, they'll be designed to reconnect Iran to Western systems. Step four, strategic distancing from Russia. This one's delicate. Iran can't afford to abandon Moscow publicly. Not why it still needs arms, drones, and diplomatic support. But behind the scenes, expect Iran to gradually reduce its military entanglements with Russia in places like Syria, and limit joint public statements that make Tehran look like a junior partner in Moscow's losing game. The goal will be to rebalance, not flip sides outright, but look more non-aligned and less toxic to Western investors. And finally, step five, diplomatic normalization, one piece at a time. You won't see embassies reopen overnight, but you will see loosened visa restrictions, back-channel oil deals with Southern Europe, quiet re-entry into certain international institutions, and possibly U.S. diplomatic gestures through third parties, like prisoner swaps, humanitarian relief, or low-level joint reforms, will be deniable, reversible, but together, they'll signal a pivot, not toward alliance, but toward survival through engagement. The West may never trust Iran, and Iran may never fully abandon its old slogans, but reality is forcing something more powerful than trust: mutual necessity. And as Iran's internal crisis deepens and its eastern allies continue to disappoint, the road west, however narrow, starts to look like the only way forward. To the team, Iran. If Iran turns west, even partially, the ripple effects won't stay in Tehran. The entire global balance shifts. And not just in the Middle East. We're talking energy markets, great power competition, and the future of America's posture across Asia and Europe. Because here's the thing, Iran isn't just another country in crisis. It's a strategic node, sitting at the crossroads of oil, ideology, and influence. And if it pivots, the consequences will be enormous. Let's start with China. Beijing has spent years trying to lock in Iran as a reliable anti-Western oil partner. They signed a 25-year deal, promised infrastructure, pitched themselves as the new anchor of Tehran's future. But they overpromise and underdeliver. If Iran starts shifting west, even slightly, China loses one of the few rogue state partners it had left in its Belt and Road vision. And that's a big problem for Beijing, because China doesn't just want Iran's oil, it wants leverage. And leverage disappears if Iran starts doing business with Europe again. Then there's Russia. Good old Russia. Moscow is already isolated. Its war in Ukraine has turned it into a global pariah, and one of its few geopolitical wins has been deepening military and economic ties with Iran, if you call that a win. But that window is closing. If Iran begins reducing arms cooperation, limiting drone exports, or even subtly walking back from Moscow's orbit, it isolates Russia even further. And in a post-Ukraine world, that's a major loss for Putin. Now, think about the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain have been cautiously managing relations with Iran, but always with suspicion. If Iran starts opening to the West, it could do two things at once: reduce the risk of war in the region, which benefits everyone economically, force the Gulf monarchies to rethink their own balancing act between Washington and Beijing. Because a Western-leaning Iran shifts the regional game. Suddenly, Tehran isn't just a threat, it becomes a competitor for influence and investment. That means a more complex Middle East, and one where America's leverage might actually grow. Oh my God, let's not get back in the Middle East. Then there's the United States. Washington doesn't trust Iran, and likely never will. But from a strategic standpoint, a neutral or semi-cooperative Iran is far better than a hostile one. It reduces pressure on U.S. bases in Iraq, lowers the risk of Israel-Iran escalation, and opens the door to energy coordination in a time of global volatility. It even puts pressure on America's adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea, by proving that isolation has limits and the West still holds gravitational pull even among former enemies. And finally, the people of Iran. A Western pivot won't solve everything. It won't erase 45 years of mistrust or undo the regime's brutality, but it could open a door to economic opportunity, civil resilience, and long-term change. It could shift the internal power balance away from hardliners and toward pragmatists. It could give Iran's next generation a reason to stay, build, instead of burn. And that, more than anything else, might be the regime's only path to survival. Now, this isn't guaranteed. The pivot might stall, it might be sabotaged, it might be reversed at the first sign of Western pressure or domestic backlash. Oh, but if it happens, Iran won't just save itself, it will reshape the map. And for the first time in decades, the world's most volatile region might start looking a little more functional. That's the opportunity, that's the risk, and that's why the world needs to pay attention. Because the next geopolitical shock might come from China or Russia or even Europe. If you're tired of globalist bullshit and ready for straight talk, subscribe to America's Geopolitics. This is Frank. See you next time.